and welcome to the Seattle Storytellers Guild StoryFest for October. And traditionally in October, we expect to hear Halloween stories, ghost stories. But this year, we decided to go with something a little different. But don't worry, next month, you get to have stories for the dark of the year. And I'm sure there will be supernatural beings and wee folk and other sort of, I don't know, maybe scary stuff. So you'll get your fix, even though it won't be tonight. There we are, ready to go. So if you were lucky enough to be at the Story Festival or Storytelling Festival last weekend, you heard Eric tell a wonderful story about Northern Lights. And now he's traveled north on the virtual highway to bring us several tales this evening. And he is the past president of the Portland Storytellers Guild, and also a great help in all this technical stuff. He's been a great help in getting even me organized. And he enjoys telling historical stories of people overcoming unusual circumstances. And he's going to share some of those tales with us. Tales of humor and disbelief are his trademark. And I think these stories will be some of both. So please welcome Eric Foxman from Portland.
Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you also to the Seattle Storytellers Guild for inviting me to come this evening. I will confess that I have not come loaded with the sort of story that Joe has shared, but that will be happening next week down in Portland, and we will be doing that virtually. You certainly are welcome to come and join us. We have a special start time of 5 o'clock, and we've got 6 of our Guild members who have joined together to bring an evening of Halloween stories on the eve of Halloween.
And I did put that information in the chat.
Thank you so much, Barry. I appreciate that. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Linda and her family. Linda's family had this tradition of celebrating life events in her family. Actually, her extended family. And in particular, they celebrated everybody's birthday. Everybody, 3 generations worth, would come to whoever's birthday's house it was, big potluck meal, big cake, ice cream, and then, of course, depending on the age of the celebrant, lots of presents or perhaps one very special present. And everybody enjoyed these family gatherings, including the matriarch of the family, Grandma, who enjoyed having a chance to see her children and her grandchildren multiple times during the course of the year. She even allowed her birthday to be celebrated just so she could see the others. But if you asked her, and really you had to do a little bit of pushing, she would only, like so many other women of her generation, would admit to being 29 and holding. Now, her daughter, Linda, had a son who was about 12 years of age, and he was old enough to have figured out what was going on with Grandma. He knew that she was 29 this year, she was 29 last year, she was 29 the year before, and he had already figured out that next year she'd be 29. But he liked Grandma, and it didn't bother him. And in fact, he was old enough to know better than to say anything about it. Situation was a little bit different with Linda's younger daughter, 6-year-old Becky. Becky, well, she adored her grandmother. Her grandmother to her was like those wise women in traditional stories and folk tales. We all know about them. And anything that Grandma said was true. No question about it. She said she was 29, she was 29. And this year, Linda, the mother, celebrated her 30th birthday. And the whole extended family came for the celebration. Big meal together, potluck meal, big cake, ice cream. But during the whole time, Linda noticed that 6-year-old Becky was sitting quietly off on the side and just kind of watching everything, quiet and pensive, which was totally unlike this child who is normally quite outgoing, quite noisy, and usually right in the midst of whatever activity was taking place. Linda began to wonder if perhaps maybe Becky was coming down with something. And she kept an eye on her, seemed to have a good appetite at the meal, seemed to partake of the cake and the ice cream, would talk with people, wasn't cranky at all. But nevertheless, she did sit off on the side by herself most of the time and didn't interact, mostly looking around. So when the party was all over and the extended family had left and they were all cleaning up, father and son were taking the trash out, giving a short opportunity for Linda and Becky to be alone. Linda got down so that she could be eye to eye with her 6-year-old child. And she said to her, "Pumpkin," you know how it is with mothers and fathers. They have these wonderful names for their children, which to us on the outside with absolutely no context mean absolutely nothing. But if you listen carefully, right in the middle of those two syllables, what you really will hear is, "Pump, I love you and I always will love you. Kin, is there anything bothering you?" And Becky, with her big, brown, 6-year-old adult eyes, looked at her mother and said, "Grandma's 29 and you're 30. I'm sorry to be the one that has to tell you this, but you were adopted." I found that story in Chicken Soup for the Grandparent's Soul. And if you're ever short of a story, go and get one of those books. You will be inspired.
That was great.
I'd like to share with you a little story about two cultural icons from the first half of the 20th century and something that joined the two of them together. One of those cultural icons was a composer and a lyricist. He was a songwriter who published over 1,250 songs, including some of the biggest songs of those first decades of the last century, and 25 #1 hits. Songs like "There's No Business Like Show Business," "Blue Skies," "Dancing Cheek to Cheek," "Putting on the Ritz." And he was the composer of the song that ended up selling more records than any other, "White Christmas." I'm talking about Irving Berlin. And as his career went on, and he was such an accomplished composer and songwriter, and so popular, that he was often asked to write songs that had a very distinct patriotic theme to them. And he rose to that occasion. He wrote songs such as Song of Freedom, "Any Bonds Today?" and another one, "I Paid My Income Tax Today." You can imagine who asked him to compose that particular song. "This Is a Great Country." "How About a Cheer for the Navy?" "For Your Country and My Country." "This Is the Army, Mr. Jones." And he was the composer of what has probably become our second national anthem, "God Bless America." But one of the first songs that he wrote early in his career, right after World War I had broken out, was a song called Down Below. And that song was sung by our other cultural icon, or I would say one of my dearest cultural heroes, Groucho Marx, who loved to sing, down below, the devil sat talking to the devil's son, who wanted to go up above, up above. He said that things down here are much too slow. And so the devil said, listen, lad, listen to me, your dear old dad. Stay down here where you belong. The folks up there, they don't know right from wrong. Their kings and queens have all gone off to war, and not one of them knows what they're fighting for. They're breaking the hearts of mothers, making butchers out of brothers. You'll find more hell up there than you will down here below. Well, Irving Berlin had gotten so many commissions to write these patriotic songs that this particular song, which was written before the United States went into World War I, and before the United States became a main and probably the primary military country on the entire face of this globe, he was concerned that it would be considered unpatriotic and people would start to think differently of him. So he asked Groucho to stop singing it. And Groucho continued singing. And then Irving Berlin asked Groucho, well, no, he actually told Groucho to stop singing. And Groucho kept singing. And then Berlin demanded and threatened that he stop singing. And Groucho continued singing that song. In fact, he was still singing it 60 years after it had been written, when he performed for over 4,000 people at a sold-out performance at Carnegie Hall in New York City. And when push came to shove, why did Groucho continue to sing it? Because, as Groucho said, that song had the 4 best lines that Irving Berlin had ever written. They're breaking the hearts of mothers, making butchers out of brothers. You'll find more hell up there than you will down here below. Groucho, an incredible thinker, an incredible philosopher. Many quotes, my favorite being, I'm going to live forever or I'll die trying. I want to tell you a story that comes from the early part of American history. Back in the spring of 1849, the Riker family left Missouri to make a new home for themselves in that new land called Oregon. Not long into their journey, Mrs. Riker fell ill, and a few weeks later she succumbed under the heat of the summer sun somewhere out in the vast Great Plains. After a quick burial off on the side of the Oregon Trail, Mr. Riker and his 3 teenage children hurried on and they caught up to their wagon train. But in the early autumn, they once again fell behind somewhere in the hills that would eventually become Montana. The cause was a broken wagon wheel, and it only took a day for them to fix it. But Mr. Riker decided that they would stay an extra day there because he wanted to replenish their diminishing supply of food. And he figured that the wagon train would be easy to catch if it only had a 2-day lead. Besides, they were in a lush, grass-filled valley, and the 2 oxen could certainly use an extra day of rest and nourishment. That night, he told his 17-year-old daughter, Jeanette, that she would spend the following day taking care of the 2 oxen there by the wagon, while he and the 2 younger teenage boys went off to get as much meat as they possibly could. The following morning, as they prepared to leave, he turned to her and said, "We'll be back before sundown. You make sure you keep that rifle close to you." And as the sun rose, she watched the 3 of them, her father and her 2 brothers, climbing the rise at the side of the valley. When they got to the top, they turned and waved to her, and then turned to go down the other side. And as they did, she waved back to them and softly said, "Goodbye. Bring me something nice, maybe a buffalo robe." Ah, a day all alone. A rare occurrence in all those months of planning for and then traveling on towards Oregon. She softly hummed and sang to herself while she cleaned up the contents of the wagon and prepared food for the next stage of their journey. For Jeanette knew that it would be easier to catch the wagon train if they didn't have to stop often in order to make meals. That night, she kept the bonfire blazing like a beacon, jumping whenever a branch cracked or a pack of any of the coyotes nearby went yipping past. And when dawn broke, she was still awake, staring bleary-eyed into the dying embers of the fire, the food that she had made sitting cold beside her. As it got light enough, she bundled herself up and she went off in the direction that her father and her brothers had gone. She anxiously expected to meet them at any moment once she crossed over the rise, and she had brought with her the biscuits she had made, for she was certain that they would be hungry. But it wasn't long before the trail petered out, and by mid-morning, she was lost. Panicked, she began to run until her breath came in ragged gasps. If only she could find that stream, she'd be able to follow it back to the valley. An hour later, she stumbled upon an almost dry creek bed, and she fervently hoped that this would be the one. She followed it, and she did indeed come out in the valley. There, the oxen, they were placidly grazing by the wagon, and they barely moved their heads when she called out, "Papa, hello? Papa?" With each passing day, the cold and the wind increased, and she knew that it would take only one storm and she would freeze to death. So she took out the axe and the spade from the wagon, and then she set to work over the next weeks, cutting saplings from the bank of the stream bed and burying them, planting them in holes that she had dug in a rough arc there out in the meadow. Then she rolled the barrel over, stood on top, lashed the tops of the saplings together, then spent days bringing over logs that she had cut and made them fit just into the spaces between those saplings. She chinked the spaces in between with moss and sod. When all of that was done, she spent an entire day taking off the heavy canvas cover from the hoops of the wagon, bringing it over and wrapping it around that frame that she had made. And then a week, building a berm of earth around the base, both as a retaining ring and an extra layer of insulation. When that was all finished, she then transferred from the wagon everything she thought she might possibly need. And when that was finished, she took the rifle and pointed it at the second ox. The first one had been killed and eaten by the wolves 2 nights before. This one had been wounded in the attack, and she knew that it wouldn't survive more than a day or so. Closing her eyes, she took that rifle and pulled the trigger. Trying to remember everything she could of her father's butchering, she cut the beast open and then cut out chunks of meat, salting them to preserve them, and then stacking them carefully inside her shelter. She worked, and worked, finishing long after it turned dark. Then, the next day, white flakes began to fill the air, and she spent 2 days collecting as much wood as she could and all the deadfall that she could find, stacking as much as she could possibly fit inside her shelter and piling the rest of it just outside the entrance. When she was done, she fell asleep, exhausted and alone, but knowing that she had done as much as she possibly could have. As at other times, a sudden sharp sound awoke her. The inside of the shelter was dark, but she knew that it was night, for through that smoke hole on top, she knew that there was only blackness. Snow had begun to fall. It had come up to her knees, and it was falling so thickly at one point that she realized that she couldn't go away from her new home. She would lose sight of it, and she would be lost forever. So she stayed inside the shelter, having to crawl out multiple times to climb up and clear out that smoke hole so that she could continue to use the wagon stove. But on that night, when she heard that sound, she sat up quietly, listening carefully. There it was again. It was right behind her, just on the other side of the saplings and the canvas. It was a strange sound, almost like a dog scratching, wanting to get in. Yet Jeanette knew that it couldn't possibly be a dog. Could it maybe be a wolf or a coyote that was drawn by the smell of the meat inside the shelter? No, it was a mountain lion circling her shelter, growling a deep guttural sound that rattled down deep into her bones, making her want to scream. She stifled herself by biting onto a piece of her quilt. And she sat there and listened while the big cat snarled angrily, reached up and swatted at the top of her shelter, the saplings bending under the weight. But it seemed that the animal was repelled by the smell of the smoke. And as it softly slunk away while snarling, Jeanette breathed a little easier, knowing she had enough wood inside the shelter still for another 4 or 5 days. Oh, but she longed for daylight. Oh, she longed for sleep. The barking of the coyotes, the howling of the wolves, the growling of the mountain lions, night after night after night. She put her head down into her hands. And despite the sound of the stalking animals outside, she slowly fell asleep. Jeanette lost track of the days. As near as she could tell, it had probably been more than 5 months since that first falling of snow. And now she woke up and there was water inside the shelter, halfway up her boots. She crawled out and looked around. The entire valley was flooding. The wagon was still on the little rise where it had been left, and she began the arduous task of taking the water-filled canvas, hauling it over to the wagon, and then lifting up the heavy fabric and draping it over the hoops of the wagon. She then salvaged as much as she possibly could from the shelter, dragged over her wet quilts and blankets, and sat inside the wagon under the cover while it rained, day after day after day. For 2 weeks, the rain continued to fall, and at one point she looked and saw her shelter collapse and float away. The saplings and the sod mixing with the slush and the ice. Oh, Jeanette was so cold and she was wet. It wasn't possible to build a fire. Besides, there hadn't been enough time to get any wood, certainly not more than would have lasted a day or two. And so she sat there as she watched the water rise and rise and rise until it was just a few finger widths below the floorboards of the wagon. And then suddenly, somewhere, a jam broke and the water began to recede. Day after day, for 3 days going down, until finally Jeanette was able to climb out of the wagon for the first time in 3 weeks, her boots sinking deep into the wet soil. Ah, but it felt good finally to be able to walk again, although she was only to take a few steps, for she was so weak from eating the last of that food that she had without fire. All that she could do was mix the raw cornmeal with water into a kind of paste. The meat that she had salted, what little was left, was raw and difficult to keep down. There were 6 of them. They just sat there and stared at her. Jeanette simply stared back. Although she had the rifle draped across her lap, the thought had never even occurred to her to possibly use it. These were the first Indians she had ever seen up close, and they looked friendly. Besides, she was so weak from rationing the last of her rancid food. She only had the strength to sit and stare. One of them rode their horse up next to the wagon and spoke to her in enough English that she was able to understand. But Jeanette didn't answer. This was the first human voice that she had heard in over 6 months, and she was overwhelmed with tears. The Indian repeated his question, "Who you?" And Jeanette finally was able to say, I'm Jeanette Riker. The two talked together for over an hour in a halting fashion, he stopping often to translate for the other 5. She didn't know much about Indians, but surely it would be better to go and live with them than to stay here in this small valley, all alone, slowly starving to death. But the Indians were very much impressed with this young woman and all that she had obviously gone through. They fed her, built a fire so that she could be warm, and 3 days later, they put her on a horse with whatever she wished to carry. And they took her over the Montana Rockies, through Idaho's Sawtooth Range, and across the eastern Washington Palouse, a journey of over 500 miles, to the Army fort at Walla Walla, where her story was recorded. It's said that she settled down to homestead and raise a family. But this is all that's known of Jeanette Riker, the young woman who survived a winter all alone in the mountains of Montana.
You're right. That story is hard to believe. And what fun the other stories were. Indeed,
Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very, very much. Amazing telling tonight. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Eric. And I think, wow, true stories that will be stuck in our heads for a while, I think. What an evening. Let's, I think, let's all applaud again for our tellers. Thank you so much. And I want to encourage everyone to come back next month on the 19th to hear the Canadian tellers. And if you'd like to stick around a little and chat or ask questions of our tellers, if they can stay, that would be lovely.